Hi, I'm Kim Mayberry, and this week I am going to do my lessons learned from The Tipping Point. It's another Malcolm Gladwell book. I loved his first Outliers book enough that I decided I needed to read the next one, so I looked up to see what else he had, and now I read Tipping Point. So I read the book. I liked the content and what it was, and here's the thing. Let me give you just a high level of what stood out to me. The first one was is I he narrowed it down to there are connectors, mavens, and salesmen. And these are three different types. As you're looking at building your business, you've got to get these people on board because really, if we think of connectors, he gives stories in there that talk about people who know a whole lot of other people. So he gives the story of that he's given this. Basically, he starts reading names out of a phone book, the New York phone book, and then has people. If you know these people's names, a name of someone who also has a similar name, go through and mark it down. What he found is that on the high end, people would know a little over 100. On the low end, they would know less than 30. So if you think about who it is that you're going to help spread your word, you need some connectors because they know a lot of people. The next one was mavens. These are the guys that just know everything about everyone. He gives an example of a professor who basically, in a certain subject, he just knows everything about everything, and just, all of his friends come to him because they're asking him these questions, and these are mavens. They know everything. But mavens aren't always just know-it-alls. They just happen to know everything. So having some mavens on board is really critical as well. The third one was salesmen. You need people that are really good at sales. And he gave an example of a financial planner out of LA who really has got this down to an art, but the salesman just connects really well with other people, that to the point that they get on board. I recommend you reading the book because of how it goes more into depth, but I really wanted to give you a high level connectors, mavens, and salesmen. Then another story that I really found fascinating. I've always heard about the New York subway system, how terrible it is, and how Rudy Giuliani came in and kind of cleaned up New York and did all these things. But he kind of had a little bit more of a backstory. So in the 80s, really, this New York subway system was scary, very scary. And they got a new person to come in and take over the subway. Everything was falling apart. People weren't paying. They were losing revenue. They were in serious trouble. And if any of you have heard of the broken glass theory, which is basically the broken glass theory is if you go into a neighborhood and there's one broken glass, then you go back into that neighborhood later, you're going to see a whole bunch more broken glass because it doesn't fix. Nothing's fixed. What happens is that if things aren't clean, things disintegrate and continue to get worse. Well, what this new subway director decided to do is they were going to clean up. He had two goals. So the first goal was that they were going to basically reclaim all of the cars. So they were going to start painting them. They were not going to have any more graffiti on them. They were going to clean them up. And the second rule is that they were losing money not just because people didn't want to ride the subway, but because people were skipping payment, and so they decided everyone was going to have to pay to ride the subway. And you think, how are those two things really going to help solve the subway problem, the crime problem? So going back to the broken glass theory, if you go through, they went through and started basically they would take a car, they would paint it, and they also figured out on some of the cars they paint, some of them had a certain finish, so they had to figure out how to scrub it off. What they would do is once a car was painted, it was reclaimed, and everything on that train had to be reclaimed. So they would never mix and match a reclaimed car versus a non-reclaimed car. They would when it comes back in, they would repaint it. They would get the graffiti off because what they were finding is that the people doing the graffiti, they would come one night, they'd do one layer, then they come back the next night and do the next layer, and come back the next night and the next layer. If they reclaimed it the first night and it came back and they had a problem, they just repaint it. So the incentive for the graffiti artists went away because they couldn't finish their work. It would just be reclaimed automatically. I thought that was interesting. So that raised a level of what people thought about the writing on the subway. They started reclaiming it. The second thing is that they were having people, and you know, I'm not a New Yorker, so any New Yorkers that are listening to this, they're probably saying this isn't really what happened. But I'm just describing what's in the book to the best of my ability. But they were having people that were just holding up the doors and basically making them pay them. So when they approached the police department about making these people pay and kind of taking back and getting fares, the police department was really against it. And because if they had to go through and book one person, that would take an entire day. And so they didn't really want to do that. But here's what they started finding out. A couple things happened. By going after the people that were helping everyone subvert and kind of hijacking it, they found, I believe the number was 1 in 10 had basically a gun or a weapon on them, so they were booking them for that. 1 in 20 had a felony. It was amazing, and my numbers may be off there, but it was amazing. So what they started doing, and I think this is really innovative, because if you're going through and getting these people, and it takes you an hour to book someone, that's a problem. But what they figured out is they did a little innovation. What if we bring in a bus and we actually bring in a center right there at the subway where we're targeting and line people up, get them on the bus? We can now process 20 in an hour. And I always find when necessity is the mother of invention. When you kind of push yourself, you go through and you start thinking of new ways to do things. And I love that about that story about the subway. How little things make a difference, because it's like if you've ever ridden a horse, if you turn the horse's head one way, that whole horse just follows. So sometimes it doesn't take having to move the entire mountain. It just takes pointing the direction. So that was one lesson. The second lesson was the importance of getting people who are connectors, mavers, and salesmen on board to help you when you're getting the message out. So, love to hear your reviews. You can see it at the bottom of the post. I've got a link to each of these, either through Audible if you want to use that, which I love, or a link there, or you can go get your own book. Either way, but I highly recommend Tipping Point by Malcolm Gladwell.